A Mother's Dark Secret, the fatal discovery that destroyed a family, criminal story. Carol Walker had always considered herself an ordinary woman with an ordinary life, but the truth was, she was far from average. She had spent most of her adult years in the small town of Marlborough, the place where she was born and raised, where her parents had lived, and where she thought she would raise her own family someday. Life in Marlborough, nestled between rolling hills and far away from the chaos of city life, had a certain rhythm to it, slow, steady, and predictable. There was comfort in that predictability, and Carol cherished it. She had a steady job at the local library, where she worked as an archivist, a job that suited her meticulous nature. The work was quiet, and the days were calm, much like the life she had built for herself. Before we can continue, if you love crime stories, subscribe to this channel to help up creating amazing stories. Now, let's continue. Her small apartment on the outskirts of town, filled with books and plants, was her sanctuary. Carol liked the quiet of her space, the solitude. Though she wasn't lonely, she relished the peace that came with being alone. She enjoyed the weekends spent at the farmer's market, chatting with familiar faces, and the evenings curled up with a book or watching a movie. There were few surprises in Carol's life. She was content with the small joys of her daily routine. Nothing extraordinary, but nothing that ever felt lacking. Her relationship with her mother, Donna, was perhaps the most important aspect of her life. Donna had raised Carol on her own after her father's death, when Carol was just a toddler. Carol had no memory of her father, only what her mother had told her. Donna had painted a picture of a kind, loving man who had tragically been taken too soon. Carol had always accepted this version of events, never once questioning her mother's words. Donna, for her part, had always been a steady figure in Carol's life, a rock. She was the type of mother who cooked dinner every night, insisted on attending every school event, and made sure Carol had everything she needed. Donna never remarried after Carol's father's death, and for the longest time, Carol had been perfectly content with that. Her mother's devotion to her was unquestioned. There was an unspoken understanding between them. Carol often referred to Donna as the best mother in the world, and she truly believed it. The idea that her mother could have ever been anything but loving and devoted was unimaginable to Carol. Donna had a strong presence. Even as Carol grew older, moved out of the house, and began her own life, they remained close. Donna had a way of making people feel at ease, her nurturing personality offering comfort to anyone who came into her orbit. Carol was proud of her mother, admired her strength, and felt secure in their relationship. Despite the occasional disagreements, nothing more than the usual mother-daughter squabbles, Carol never thought twice about the bond they shared. She trusted Donna implicitly. The family home, a modest but charming house on the edge of Marlborough, was where Carol had spent her childhood. It sat on a quiet street, lined with trees that bloomed in the spring and provided shade in the summer. The house was the perfect reflection of her mother, warm, inviting, and filled with love. Every room was a testament to Donna's meticulous nature, from the perfectly arranged flower beds in the front yard to the neatly organized cabinets inside. Carol had always found comfort in the familiarity of the house, its smells, its creaks, its colors. It was her home, and it was Donna's home. It was also a place where Carol frequently returned, whether to visit or to escape the stresses of her own life. Though she had grown up and built her own home, she often found herself drawn back to her mother's place. After a long week at work, a visit to Donna's house felt like a balm to her tired soul. They would drink tea together, chat about the latest gossip from town, or reminisce about the old days. Sometimes they didn't even need words. Just being in the same room with her mother was enough. It was during one of these visits, as Carol was going through some old family boxes in the attic, that she stumbled upon a collection of old letters and photographs. She had come to help her mother clean out some things, a task Donna had been avoiding for years. The attic, filled with boxes of forgotten memories, was a treasure trove of family history. Carol enjoyed sifting through the dusty old albums, recalling moments from her childhood. She found pictures of her father, though only a few, as he had passed before she could form any memories of him, and photographs of family holidays, birthdays, and events that seemed as distant as ancient history. As Carol flipped through a particularly large album, she noticed a faded newspaper clipping tucked between two photos. It was a story about a man who had gone missing in Marlborough. The name was not familiar at first, but as her eyes scanned the article, she was struck by the man's identity. He shared the same name as Donna's first husband, Carol's biological father. The man in the article had disappeared decades ago, but Carol had never heard about it. The article didn't offer many details, only that he had vanished under mysterious circumstances. It was a small-town story, one that probably hadn't made much of an impact at the time, but now it seemed important. Carol's heart skipped a beat. She had always known that Donna had been married before, but she never really pressed for details. She had never been curious about the past. After all, her father had died when she was young, and Donna had always told her that he was a good man who loved her deeply. Carol had never questioned this. She had no reason to. But now, seeing that article in front of her, a flicker of doubt crept into her mind. Why had her mother never spoken about the disappearance? Why had she never mentioned anything about the circumstances surrounding it? The discovery left Carol with a sinking feeling in her stomach. She wasn't sure why, but something about the whole situation felt off. She couldn't shake the image of the newspaper article from her mind. Her curiosity got the better of her, and she began to search through more boxes in the attic, hoping to find more information. The deeper she dug, the more unsettled she became. There were pictures of her mother with a man she didn't recognize, photos of family events that seemed out of place. Who was this man? Why had Donna never talked about him? After a sleepless night of turning the mystery over in her mind, Carol knew that she had to ask Donna about it. But even as she made up her mind to confront her mother, a sense of dread settled over her. Could her mother have been hiding something all these years? Donna had always been so open with Carol about everything, her childhood, her life, her career. But this was different. There was something more to the story, and Carol was beginning to fear that the truth might be darker than she had ever imagined. When Carol sat down with her mother the next day, she felt a heavy tension in the air. The conversation started off light, talking about the weather, the latest gossip from town, but Carol's mind was elsewhere. She couldn't shake the feeling that the woman she had known all her life, the woman who had always been her protector, was hiding something monumental. Eventually, she couldn't hold back any longer. "Mom," she said, her voice quieter than she intended. "I found something. A newspaper article about a man who went missing in town. His name." Carol paused, searching her mother's face for any sign of recognition. "It's the same as Dad's." Donna's reaction was immediate. Her eyes flickered with something Carol couldn't place, and her lips pressed together in a tight line. "That's not something you need to worry about," Donna said, her voice suddenly cold. "It's from a long time ago. There's nothing to talk about." But Carol wasn't so easily deterred. "Mom, I need to know. What happened to him? Why didn't you ever tell me about this?" Donna's expression faltered for a moment, and Carol swore she saw a flicker of something in her mother's eyes, a fear, a guilt, something that had never been there before. Carol pressed further, her voice shaking with a mixture of confusion and suspicion. And then, in a quiet voice that Carol would never forget, Donna said, "I killed him." The words hung in the air, as if time had stopped. Carol's heart skipped a beat. She didn't know how to react. Donna's gaze was cold, unwavering, as if she had just spoken a simple truth. There was no regret in her eyes, no sadness, just an eerie calm. Carol's mind raced, unable to process what she had just heard. "What do you mean?" "You killed him?" she asked, her voice cracking. Donna's expression remained unchanged. "I had no choice. He was going to take you away from me." The words Donna had spoken echoed in Carol's mind, a dull ringing that seemed to drown out everything else. "I killed him." The silence that followed felt impossibly heavy, like the air itself had thickened, wrapping around Carol in a suffocating grip. The calm, steady rhythm of her life had been shattered in an instant, replaced by a sense of vertigo that left her reeling. Her hands trembled as she sat there, staring at her mother, struggling to comprehend the enormity of what had just been revealed. Donna, however, remained eerily calm, her gaze unwavering, as if the confession she had just made were a mere statement of fact. She didn't flinch, didn't seem to care that her daughter was visibly shaking in front of her. Donna simply sat back in her chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her face as smooth and unreadable as a stone. It was as though she had just dropped a bombshell in the middle of the room and then waited for Carol to catch up. Carol's mind raced. She wanted to scream, to demand more answers, but the words caught in her throat. What did her mother mean by that? Had it really happened the way Donna said it had? How had she managed to hide such a horrifying truth for so many years? Carol had always thought she knew her mother inside and out, but this revelation made her wonder if the woman sitting across from her was a stranger entirely. She had raised Carol alone after the death of her father, been the epitome of the loving, devoted mother. How could this woman, the woman who had spent years holding her when she cried, telling her she was safe, possibly be capable of murder? "I don't understand," Carol whispered, her voice barely audible. She felt as though the ground beneath her feet had suddenly turned to quicksand. Her entire world felt like it was slipping away, piece by piece. What happened? Why did you do it?" Donna's expression didn't change. She seemed unaffected by Carol's turmoil, and that, in itself, was what terrified her most. There was no guilt, no emotion, nothing to indicate that this had been anything other than a simple, almost casual admission. "It was a long time ago, Carol," Donna said softly, her voice carrying a hint of finality. "I don't expect you to understand, but I did what I had to do. I couldn't let him take you away from me." The words felt like a punch to the gut. Carol had always known that her parents' marriage had ended in a divorce, but she had never heard anything about the details. All her life, Donna had painted the picture of a loving relationship that had simply fallen apart, nothing sinister, nothing dark. But now, in the aftermath of this conversation, Carol felt as though a whole new, terrible version of her mother was emerging, one that had been buried beneath years of lies and silences. The mother she thought she knew was fading, replaced by a woman who had confessed to taking another person's life. Carol's thoughts were jumbled, her emotions raw. She didn't know how to process what was happening. She had always trusted her mother implicitly. Donna had been her rock, the one person in her life who had never let her down. And now, that foundation had cracked, leaving Carol floundering in the dark. The idea that her mother had murdered her father, Carol's biological father, was too much to bear. "I need to understand," Carol said, her voice shaking. "What happened that night? Why didn't you ever tell me about any of this?" She was desperate for answers, even though she wasn't sure if she was ready to hear them. But she had to know. The silence in the room felt unbearable now, oppressive, and she couldn't let it stand. Donna let out a sigh, as if the weight of her words had finally settled on her. She seemed to be carefully considering Carol's question, her eyes narrowing in thought. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, Donna spoke again, but this time her tone was softer, almost regretful, as if the confession had cost her something more than she was willing to admit. "It wasn't like what you're thinking," Donna said, her voice low and steady. "I didn't kill him out of hate, Carol. It wasn't like that at all. He was going to take you away from me. He said he was going to fight for custody. He wanted to take you and move far away. I couldn't let him do that. I couldn't lose you." Carol stared at her mother in shock. The idea that Donna had killed someone to protect her was something she could not even begin to wrap her mind around. The rational part of her understood that Donna's actions had come from a place of fear, of desperation, but the emotional part of her struggled to reconcile that with the person Donna had always been. Murder was murder. No matter how it was justified, no matter what emotions had been behind it, it was still a life lost. "Mom," Carol began, but she couldn't find the words to continue. She wanted to shout at her mother, to tell her how wrong she was, but she felt strangely paralyzed. It wasn't just the revelation of the murder that stunned her. It was the fact that Donna seemed to have been carrying the secret for so long, and yet had shown no sign of remorse or guilt. How could a mother do that? How could a mother live with such a terrible secret for decades and still look her child in the eyes every day? Donna's gaze softened, and she leaned forward, placing a hand gently on Carol's. "I didn't want you to know about any of this, Carol," she said quietly. "I thought I could keep it hidden, protect you from it. But now you know, and I can't undo that. But I need you to understand, I did it because I loved you. I did it because I couldn't bear the thought of losing you." Carol felt a cold knot settle in her stomach. The rational part of her wanted to believe her mother's words, to understand the twisted logic behind them. But it didn't make sense. Love shouldn't have to come at the cost of another person's life. Love didn't justify murder. "Mom, how can you say that? How can you expect me to just accept this?" Carol's voice cracked with the weight of the question. "You killed him. You killed my father. And now you expect me to understand? To forgive you?" Donna's hand tightened on hers, and for the first time, Carol noticed a flicker of something like vulnerability in her mother's eyes. "I didn't want you to know, Carol. I didn't want you to look at me like this. I didn't want to lose you, too. But I understand if you hate me. I understand if you can't forgive me. I never wanted you to carry this burden. But now you know, and I can't take it back." For the first time since the conversation began, Carol's emotions began to surge. Anger, confusion, pain. How could Donna be so cold about something so horrific? How could she not see the damage that had been done? How could she not see how her confession had ripped Carol's world apart? "I don't know what to do with this," Carol whispered, her voice barely audible. Her eyes filled with tears, but she quickly wiped them away, unwilling to let her mother see her cry. She felt betrayed, shattered by the very person she had trusted the most in the world. Donna's expression softened even further, and she gently pulled Carol into an embrace. For a moment, Carol let herself be held, her body stiff and unwilling to melt into her mother's arms. The comforting familiarity of the gesture, however, was now tainted. Donna was still her mother, but everything had changed. The woman who had once been her protector, the woman she had idolized, had just confessed to a brutal crime, and now Carol didn't know who she was anymore. "Carol, I didn't want this to be your burden," Donna murmured, her voice low and full of sorrow. "But I couldn't live with the lie any longer. I needed you to know the truth." Carol pulled back from the embrace, her mind spinning. She needed to understand more, needed to know exactly what had happened. "What happened that night, Mom? How did it happen?"
Donna hesitated.
Carol could see her mother's face contort, as though reliving the moment. "He was angry," Donna finally said, her voice distant. "We had a fight about custody, about you. I told him I wouldn't let him take you. I told him I'd do anything to keep you.
And he didn't believe me.
He said I was crazy, that I didn't deserve you. He told me I'd never see you again." The words were searing, and Carol could barely keep up with the flood of emotions coursing through her. Her father had been an angry man, a man who had wanted to take her away from her mother? Carol couldn't picture it. The man in the photograph, the one her mother had spoken so highly of, was now a stranger. "Then what happened?" she asked, her voice trembling. Donna closed her eyes briefly, as though trying to block out the memory. "I didn't plan it, Carol. But when he lunged at me, I didn't know what else to do. I grabbed the knife and it happened so fast. I didn't even realize until it was too late." Carol sat in stunned silence, her body frozen in disbelief. She had always believed that her mother was a gentle, loving woman. The idea that Donna had killed her father in a moment of fear and rage was too much to bear. For the first time, Carol felt the weight of the secret. It wasn't just a family secret. It was a life-altering truth that had been hidden for far too long. And now that she knew it, there was no turning back. The moment Donna confessed to the murder of Carol's father, everything shifted. The world that Carol had spent her whole life building, the reality in which her mother was a rock-solid, dependable figure, had come crashing down like a house of cards. What had been once a simple, predictable existence, filled with routines and small comforts, was now completely out of balance. Her mind reeled with questions, doubts, and the horrifying image of her mother's calm demeanor when she spoke of the crime. It wasn't just the murder that shocked Carol, it was the casual way Donna had described it, as though it were just another chapter in a long-forgotten history, tucked away and sealed off. The days following the confrontation were a blur. Carol couldn't return to the life she had once known. She couldn't go back to the library, couldn't sit at her desk, could barely hold a conversation with friends. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her mother's cold, unfeeling face, the calm, almost clinical way she had admitted to the murder. There was no real emotion in Donna's voice, no remorse. She spoke as though she had committed the crime for the most natural of reasons, to protect her daughter. But how could that justification ever be enough? The more Carol thought about it, the more the image of her mother, the woman she had loved and trusted, became monstrous in her mind. How could someone like her, so seemingly gentle and kind, harbor such a terrible secret? The haunting truth had begun to gnaw at Carol, eating away at her peace. There was no escaping it. Donna's words had become an indelible stain on everything that had come before. It wasn't just that her mother had killed a man, but that the man had been Carol's father. The person whose name she had carried all these years, the man whose absence had defined her life in ways she hadn't even understood. Donna had painted him as a loving husband, as a man who had been stolen from them too soon, a casualty of fate. But now Carol realized that the picture she had always accepted was a lie. He wasn't a martyr. He was a threat. And in the end, he had been silenced by the woman she had trusted the most. The realization forced Carol to re-examine every memory she had ever had, every small detail of her childhood, in the light of this new knowledge. All the times Donna had whispered sweet reassurances to her, all the times she had hugged her and wiped away her tears, was that all just an act? Had Donna only been pretending to be the perfect mother, a facade she had maintained to hide the darker truth? Carol found herself questioning everything. The safety, the stability she had felt all her life began to seem like a fragile illusion, built on a foundation of deceit. Carol tried to distance herself from her mother, at least temporarily. She needed space, time to think, time to process the enormity of what she had learned. But every time she tried to reach out to others, to talk to her friends, or even her colleagues at work, she found that the words wouldn't come. No one could understand. No one had the same history, the same personal connection to the horrifying truth that was now weighing down on her. How could she explain to anyone that her mother had killed a man? How could she explain the emptiness that had begun to swallow her whole, making her feel like a stranger in her own life? The isolation Carol felt was suffocating. It was as though she had stepped into a completely unfamiliar world, a world where the rules had changed, where the people she thought she knew and trusted were no longer what they seemed. Her desire for answers had only deepened the mystery. She couldn't simply let the confession lie there. She couldn't just ignore the fact that her mother had been living with such a terrible, dark secret for so many years. Donna had promised to keep her safe, to love and protect her, but Carol now wondered, was that promise ever real? Was her love truly unconditional? Or had it been manipulated, twisted into something darker, something selfish? Carol found herself haunted by the desire to know more, to unravel the mystery of her father's death. What had really happened that night? How had Donna been able to cover it up? How could she have lived all these years with such a monstrous truth buried inside her? Donna had been so careful, so meticulous in her life. She had erased every trace of the crime, kept it hidden from prying eyes. Carol knew that the only way to truly understand what had happened was to dig deeper, to search for the secrets that had been buried beneath layers of lies and silence. But doing so would mean entering a dark, painful place, a place she wasn't sure she was prepared to go. And yet, Carol couldn't let it go. The pull to uncover the truth was stronger than her fear, stronger than her desire to protect the illusion of the perfect family that had been so carefully cultivated over the years. She began her search cautiously, trying to piece together the fragments of her father's disappearance. She knew she would have to confront Donna again, to ask her questions, painful, difficult questions, but she was terrified of what the answers might reveal. Would Donna break down in front of her? Would she regret the past? Or would she stand by her actions, cold and unrepentant, as she had done before? Carol spent hours at the local library, combing through old records and articles, looking for any trace of the past that might explain what had happened. She even visited the courthouse, trying to access public records of the case, but everything was sealed. There was nothing left, it seemed, for her to find. The more she searched, the more she felt the weight of the wall that Donna had so carefully constructed around her secret. The fact that the case had been buried so completely only made Carol more desperate to learn the truth. It was as if Donna had erased the past, covered up every trace of the crime, and now Carol was left with nothing but a trail of empty, unanswered questions. As the days passed, Carol became more obsessed with uncovering the truth. She began to track down people who might have known something, neighbors who had lived near the house at the time, old friends of her mother's, anyone who might have remembered something about the night her father disappeared. She even visited the local police station, but all the officers she spoke with claimed to know nothing about the case. It was as though the entire town had forgotten, or worse, had been complicit in the cover-up. No one would speak. No one seemed willing to help her uncover the truth. The feeling of being alone in this pursuit was suffocating. It was as though the world had conspired to keep Donna's dark secret hidden, and Carol was the only one willing to dig into the muck. She couldn't stop herself. The truth was like a drug now, and she was addicted. The more she searched, the more she felt as though she were chasing a phantom, something intangible and elusive that would always remain just beyond her grasp. The one person she could not confront was Donna. Carol was terrified of what might happen if she did. Every time she considered going back to her mother, asking more questions, demanding more answers, a wave of dread washed over her. She knew that her mother would shut her down, would make her feel guilty for even questioning the past. Donna had already shown how far she was willing to go to keep her secrets, how she had lived her life pretending to be someone she wasn't, keeping the darkest parts of herself hidden from Carol. The thought of confronting her mother about her father's death was unbearable, but Carol knew that she had to. She had to face the truth, no matter how painful it would be. It was one evening, as Carol sat in her apartment, poring over more old newspapers and trying to make sense of the vague articles she had found, that she realized something. This wasn't just about uncovering the past. It wasn't just about getting answers to her questions. It was about reclaiming her life. The more she dug into the dark, painful truth of her mother's past, the more she realized that she couldn't continue living in this world of shadows and half-truths. The lies, the deception, they had created a world in which Carol no longer felt safe. She had to confront her mother. She had to tear down the wall of silence that had existed between them, even if it meant destroying the very foundation of everything they had built together. Carol knew that once she stepped into that dark space, there would be no going back. The truth, once unearthed, could never be buried again. It would change everything. Her relationship with Donna, her sense of self, her understanding of who she had been, and who she could still become. But she could no longer live in the dark. The moment of reckoning was coming. The more Carol delved into the truth of her father's death, the more she found herself tangled in a web of emotions and questions that had no easy answers. It wasn't just the discovery of her mother's crime that disturbed her. It was the sense of betrayal that had begun to gnaw at her, a gnawing feeling that no amount of research, no amount of investigation, could alleviate. Every time she found a new detail or piece of information, it seemed to open up more wounds. Her father's death, her mother's deception, it all felt too much to bear. At first, Carol tried to ignore the voice in her head that told her to stop, to leave things alone. She pushed those thoughts aside, insisting that the truth was worth the pain. But as the days turned into weeks, she began to realize just how deeply the investigation was affecting her. The search for answers had consumed her. She spent hours poring over old police reports, scouring through newspapers, and visiting every person who might have known something, only to hit dead ends at every turn. The truth felt so elusive, so intangible, as though it was slipping just out of her grasp with every new lead that failed to materialize. But no matter how much she uncovered, Carol could never escape the growing weight of the emotional toll it was taking on her. She had spent her entire life believing that her mother was a saint, a woman who had sacrificed everything for her child. Now, everything Carol had known was a lie. Donna's murder of her father wasn't some random act of violence. It was a cold, calculated decision made out of fear and desperation. And Carol couldn't ignore the chilling reality that her mother, the woman she had trusted most in the world, had killed a man and lived with it for years. As time went on, Carol started to change. The transformation wasn't immediate or dramatic, but it was real. She became more withdrawn, more isolated. The people who had once been her friends seemed distant, like they existed in another world. How could she explain to them what she was going through? How could she talk to anyone about her mother's crime without sounding like she was losing her grip on reality? No one, she thought, would understand the horror of discovering that your entire life had been built on a lie. The emotional toll was starting to show in more subtle ways. Carol's physical appearance began to change. Her posture slumped as the weight of the secret pressed down on her, her eyes hollow and tired from sleepless nights spent digging for the truth. She stopped caring about the little things she used to enjoy, the things that once brought her comfort. Her favorite books, her walks in the park, even the occasional trip to the movies, everything had become meaningless. The thrill of uncovering the truth was replaced by a gnawing emptiness, a feeling that no matter what she uncovered, nothing would ever make it right. One night, after a particularly fruitless search through old records, Carol found herself sitting in the kitchen, staring blankly at the half-empty cup of coffee in front of her. It was nearly midnight, but sleep eluded her as it had for weeks. The silence of her apartment felt suffocating, as if the walls were closing in on her, pressing down on her chest. She had been so consumed by the need to understand what had happened to her father, to piece together the puzzle of his disappearance, that she had lost sight of everything else. She had been so focused on the investigation, on the pieces of the past, that she had neglected the present. And now she couldn't escape the overwhelming feeling that she had sacrificed her peace of mind for nothing. Her phone buzzed, interrupting her spiraling thoughts. It was a text from Julia, a friend from college who had been trying to reach her for weeks. Carol had avoided answering her calls, too wrapped up in her own torment to focus on anything else. But tonight, she couldn't avoid it any longer. She opened the message, and the words, simple and straightforward, hit her like a tidal wave. I know you're going through a lot right now, Carol, but you can't keep doing this to yourself. I'm here for you, whenever you're ready to talk. Please don't shut us out. The message stung, but in a way, it also felt like a lifeline. Julia was right. Carol had been shutting herself off from the world, convinced that she had to go through this alone. She had been so fixated on uncovering the past that she had neglected the present and the people who cared about her. For the first time in weeks, Carol allowed herself to feel the full weight of that realization. She had been isolating herself, living in a world of darkness and secrets, but there were people in her life who still cared, who still wanted to help her through this. After a few moments of hesitation, Carol typed back, I don't know how to explain it, Julia. I feel like everything's falling apart. I'm scared. The response came almost immediately. I understand, but you don't have to go through this alone. Whatever you're facing, you don't have to carry it by yourself. Let us help. Carol sat back in her chair, feeling the tears she had been holding back for days begin to well up. The floodgates opened, and for the first time since she had confronted her mother, she allowed herself to cry. She cried for the pain, for the betrayal, for the years of her life that had been built on a lie. She cried for the loss of her father, even though she had never known him. She cried for the woman who had been her mother, the woman who had shattered everything Carol thought she understood about family and trust. And she cried for herself, for the future she had once envisioned, now completely transformed into something she could hardly recognize. It was a long time before Carol stopped crying, but when she did, she felt an overwhelming sense of relief. It wasn't that the pain was gone. It was still there, festering beneath the surface. But somehow, in sharing her grief with Julia, in allowing herself to be vulnerable, Carol felt a little lighter. The burden of the secret wasn't hers to bear alone. She wasn't alone. And that thought, however small, gave her the strength to keep going. The next morning, Carol decided to take a step back from the investigation. She wasn't going to stop searching for answers, not entirely, but she needed a break. She couldn't keep living in the past. She needed to reclaim her present, to reconnect with the people who cared about her. For the first time in weeks, she reached out to her friends, making plans to meet Julia for coffee. She knew that she couldn't keep shutting them out. Her isolation had only made everything worse. There was no easy fix for what she was going through, but maybe, just maybe, opening up to the people who loved her could help her navigate the painful road ahead. The decision to stop the relentless pursuit of the truth for just a while didn't come easily, but it felt like the first step toward finding some semblance of balance in her life again. She couldn't deny that the secrets her mother had kept from her had changed everything. But the deeper truth, Carol realized, was that she couldn't let those secrets consume her any longer. The truth was painful, yes, but it didn't define her life. She was still her own person, still someone who deserved love, peace, and a future free from the weight of her mother's past. Carol still had questions, so many questions, but she wasn't going to let the pursuit of those answers be her undoing. It was time to take a breath, to step out of the shadows, and to reclaim the life she still had left. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she could face it. That afternoon, as Carol sat at the coffee shop with Julia, sipping her cappuccino and feeling the warmth of the drink fill her, she realized that this moment was the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter where she could still search for the truth, but not at the cost of everything else. A chapter where she could begin to heal, to rebuild, to understand the past without letting it control her future. Her mother's confession had shattered her understanding of the world, but Carol was determined not to let it define her. The truth would come, but for now, Carol had taken her first step toward adapting to a new reality, one that didn't revolve around the darkness of her family's secrets. Carol couldn't shake the feeling that, despite everything she had uncovered, the truth was still out of reach. No matter how many old records she sifted through, how many hours she spent speaking to people who had known her father or the community at the time of his disappearance, she wasn't getting closer to the one thing she craved most, a concrete answer. She had been running in circles, stuck in a seemingly endless loop of dead ends and half-answers. Each time she uncovered a detail that hinted at the truth, it dissolved before her eyes, like vapor. Her mother's cold confession was just the first step, but Carol had to know more. The one piece of the puzzle that still haunted her was the night of the murder itself. Donna had told her in such a detached way, as if the murder had been a minor footnote in the story of their lives. She had claimed it was an act of self-preservation, a terrible but necessary act to protect Carol from a man who had been abusive, a man who had posed a threat to both of their lives. But Carol was not convinced. There were gaps, contradictions in her mother's story that could not be ignored. How could Donna, who had always presented herself as the doting, loving mother, so easily end her husband's life? And why had it remained such a well-kept secret for so many years? Carol needed more. She needed to know what had really happened that night, who her father truly was, and who Donna had become in the process of hiding the truth. It wasn't enough to just accept her mother's word. She needed to find the hard evidence that would make everything make sense. She wanted to uncover the motivations that had led to her father's death, to understand the lengths her mother had gone to in order to protect herself, to understand the secret that had festered for so long, without her even knowing. A breakthrough came when Carol managed to track down an old friend of her mother's, a woman named Harriet, who had once been close to the family in the years before her father's disappearance. Carol had heard her mother mention Harriet only a few times over the years, often with a sense of discomfort, as if the relationship had ended abruptly. But now, Harriet seemed like the one person who might hold the missing pieces of the puzzle. Carol reached out to her, cautiously at first, unsure of how much Harriet might be willing to reveal. But to her surprise, Harriet agreed to meet. When Carol arrived at the small, quiet cafe where they had agreed to meet, she immediately noticed that Harriet seemed different from what she had imagined. She was older now, of course, but there was something else, something in her eyes. It was as if Harriet carried a burden, one that matched Carol's own, but was too heavy for her to speak aloud. Carol tried to steady herself as she took a seat across from her. "Carol, it's been a long time," Harriet said, her voice soft but strained. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again." Carol felt a lump in her throat. She was both relieved and anxious. I've been trying to understand what happened to my father," she said, her words coming out slowly, carefully. "And I think you might know something about it."
Something important.
Harriet's eyes darted to the side, and for a moment, Carol could see the wariness in her expression. But then slowly, Harriet nodded. "I know more than you think," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But it's not something I can talk about easily. There are things, Carol, things your mother doesn't want you to know." Carol leaned forward, her pulse quickening. "Please," she urged. "I need to know. I need to understand. I can't keep living with this, wondering what really happened to him." Harriet sighed deeply, as if the weight of the past had suddenly become too much for her to bear. "Your father," she began, her voice trembling, "he wasn't the man your mother always said he was. He wasn't a saint. He had a temper, Carol. A bad one. And your mother, she had her own ways of dealing with it." Carol felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean?" she asked, barely able to form the words. Harriet hesitated. She looked around nervously, as though she was expecting someone to overhear their conversation. "And there were things going on in that house," she whispered. "Things that no one knew about. Things your mother never wanted you to find out." Carol's heart pounded in her chest. The pieces were starting to shift, but they didn't form the picture she had expected. She had always thought her mother was the victim, the innocent one, wronged by a cruel man. But now, as Harriet's words settled in, Carol began to feel as though the truth was not so simple. "Your mother loved him, but she was afraid of him too," Harriet continued, her eyes darkening with memory. "Your father was unpredictable. He would fly into rages, at her, at anyone who crossed him. It was a volatile relationship. And Donna? She did everything she could to keep the peace. But in the end, it wasn't enough. He went too far." Carol sat in stunned silence, trying to process what Harriet was saying. Her mind was a whirl of questions, of doubt. Was Donna's confession a twisted version of the truth? Had Carol's father really been abusive, as Harriet implied? Was the murder a desperate act of self-defense, as Donna had said, or was there more to it? "The night he died," Harriet continued, "it wasn't just about protecting you. It was about your mother finally reaching a breaking point. She'd been hiding the abuse for years. But that night, something snapped in her. She wasn't just protecting you, Carol. She was protecting herself. And she did what she had to do." The words were like a punch to Carol's gut. Her mind raced, trying to reconcile this new version of her father. Her father, the man she had never known, the man whose absence had defined her entire life. He wasn't the man she had imagined him to be. He wasn't a loving husband taken too soon. He was someone entirely different, someone dark and violent. And her mother, the woman who had raised her, had become something else entirely in order to survive it. Suddenly, everything she had learned, everything she had thought she understood, felt like a lie. The comfortable narrative she had built over the years, the story of a good man lost, a mother forced to raise her daughter alone, was crumbling before her eyes. The truth, as hard as it was more complicated than she could have ever imagined. "Did you know?" Carol asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Did you know that she killed him?" Harriet looked at her with sorrow in her eyes, her expression conflicted.
Yes.
But it wasn't like she planned it, Carol. It wasn't a murder, not in the way you think. It was a culmination of years of fear, of him losing control. And in that moment, your mother made a decision she was going to survive. And she did. But it cost her everything. It cost her the life she could have had. It cost her the peace she wanted. Carol's mind was reeling. She had wanted answers, but now she felt as if she had stumbled into a labyrinth of half-truths. She had imagined the truth would come to her neatly, in a package tied with a bow. But what she had uncovered was a tangled web of fear, love, survival, and guilt. And at the center of it all was her mother, the woman who had raised her, the woman who had been everything to her. Donna was not a saint, but nor was she a monster. She was simply a woman who had been broken by the circumstances of her life and had done whatever it took to keep going. Carol sat back in her chair, feeling the weight of the truth pressing down on her. She had uncovered what she wanted, but it was not the revelation she had been hoping for. It was a truth that had shattered her world. The woman she had known as her mother was not the person she had imagined. She had killed her father, yes, but she had done so out of a desperate need for survival, not cold-blooded murder. Donna was a woman who had been pushed to the edge, and in that moment, she had made a choice. She had chosen to survive at any cost. But Carol couldn't shake the question that lingered in her mind. Could she ever forgive her mother for what she had done? Could she ever understand the depth of the choices Donna had made? And could she rebuild the life she had once known, now that the truth had come crashing down on her? The answers, Carol realized, were not clear. But the truth was undeniable. And in that moment, she understood something important. The past could not be erased. It could only be faced, however painful that might be. The weight of the truth Carol had uncovered was suffocating. It wasn't just the knowledge that her mother had killed her father, or even the complexities of that act. It was the realization that the foundation of her entire life had been built on lies. She had lived in a bubble, a safe, comfortable world where everything had seemed ordered and predictable. Now, it was as if that bubble had burst, and the shards of it were cutting into her every waking moment. Carol had once believed that uncovering the truth would bring clarity, that it would resolve her questions and ease the aching void she'd carried all these years. But the reality was much darker, more complicated, and infinitely harder to bear. The answers she had found, the revelations about her mother's past, her father's violence, and the way her mother had killed him, did not give her the peace she had imagined. Instead, they left her with a gnawing emptiness, a sense of betrayal that left her questioning her very identity. The more she tried to digest what she had learned, the more she felt herself unraveling. She had always looked up to her mother, Donna, the woman who had been her rock, the one who had raised her single-handedly, the woman she believed to be incapable of harm. But now she saw Donna for who she really was, a woman who had committed murder to survive. Donna had killed, yes, but she had done so under duress, and Carol understood that. But what Carol couldn't reconcile was the way Donna had shielded herself with the silence of all these years. Donna had created a new life, one that excluded the truth, one that relied on deception and manipulation to maintain the image of a dedicated mother and wife. For Carol, that image of Donna had been shattered beyond repair. It wasn't the crime itself that hurt so deeply. It was the lie that had shaped her entire childhood, the lie that had made Carol believe that her father's disappearance was a random tragedy, that he had simply vanished without a trace. It wasn't until Donna's confession and the conversations that followed that Carol had understood the true nature of the events that had unfolded in their home all those years ago. There were days when Carol couldn't even look at her mother without feeling a searing mix of disgust and pain. How could Donna, the woman who had raised her, who had promised to protect her, have done something so monstrous and then lived with it for so long? How could she have erased the truth from Carol's life, kept her in the dark, allowed her to believe that everything was fine when, in reality, her whole life had been defined by the consequences of Donna's violent actions? The more Carol reflected, the more she realized how much of her own identity had been wrapped up in the idealized version of her mother. As a child, Carol had admired Donna's strength. She had admired the way her mother had faced every challenge with determination, how she had weathered the storms of life, from financial hardship to the loss of her husband. But now Carol saw the cracks beneath that surface. She saw the fear that had driven Donna to make choices that ultimately destroyed their family, choices that had twisted the course of Carol's own life in ways she hadn't even begun to comprehend. Donna's secret had shaped Carol's childhood, distorted the way she viewed relationships, and, in many ways, defined her sense of self. It was a cruel irony. Carol had spent so many years wanting answers, wanting to know the truth. But now that she had it, she felt as though she had lost everything. The confrontation with her mother that night, when Carol had first threatened to expose the truth, had been a pivotal moment in their relationship. Donna had reacted with cold detachment at first, refusing to show any remorse or vulnerability. Carol had expected some form of apology, some acknowledgement of the damage Donna's actions had caused, not just to Carol, but to the family as a whole. But Donna had said nothing of the sort. Instead, she had looked at Carol with an almost chilling calm, as though nothing had changed. "You're wrong," Donna had said in a low, measured voice. "I did what had to be done. I did it for us, for you." At the time, Carol had struggled to understand the logic behind Donna's words. How could Donna justify murder, no matter the circumstances? How could she have taken a life and then spent decades hiding the truth as if it were nothing more than a trivial detail? But in that moment, Carol had learned something deeper about her mother. Donna was not going to change. She was not going to express regret or sorrow. Donna had buried the truth for so long that she no longer felt the weight of it. The layers of denial had become so thick that they had become her new reality. She had been living in the shadow of her crime for so many years that to her, it was simply part of who she was. Carol's threat to expose the truth had not fazed her mother, at least not in the way Carol had hoped. Donna's immediate reaction had been one of cold pragmatism. She hadn't begged for Carol's forgiveness, or tried to justify her actions in a way that might have elicited some sympathy. No, Donna had simply seen Carol's pursuit of the truth as a threat to her carefully constructed life. And, in the moment of fear and desperation, Donna had made a decision that would haunt Carol for the rest of her life. That night, while Carol slept in her bed, Donna had entered her room, a pillow in hand. It wasn't something Carol could have anticipated. It was too surreal, too horrific to even consider. But Donna had crossed that final line. She had been so terrified of being exposed, of losing everything, that she had decided to silence Carol once and for all. Her daughter, her own flesh and blood, was now the only thing standing between her and the life she had created after the murder. Carol would not remain the innocent, ignorant child forever, and Donna could not allow that truth to come to light. When Carol had woken, gasping for air as Donna's hands tightened around the pillow, she had fought like she had never fought before. She had struggled with every ounce of her strength to break free from her mother's grasp. The room had been eerily silent, save for the sound of their breaths, Donna's measured, controlled, and Carol's frantic, desperate. In that moment, Carol had understood something profound. She had been nothing more than an obstacle to Donna's carefully constructed world, a casualty of her mother's years of secrecy, of her inability to confront the truth of her own actions. When Carol had managed to break free, she ran from the room, the terror and disbelief still fresh in her chest. She had barely enough time to gather herself before fleeing into the cold night, shaking as she dialed the police. In that instant, as she had stood in front of their house, looking back at the place that had once been her home, Carol realized that everything she had known about love, about family, about trust, had been a lie. Donna was no longer the woman she had once idolized. She was someone else, someone dangerous, someone capable of anything. The police had arrived quickly. Donna had been arrested without resistance, though she still did not show any remorse for what she had done. The whole scene played out like a nightmare, but for Carol, it was the beginning of something new. As Donna was led away in handcuffs, Carol was left standing in the ruins of their family's facade, the wreckage of her life scattered around her like broken glass. In the following days, as the shock of the events wore off, Carol began to piece together the full extent of the cost of the truth. She had gotten what she wanted. She had uncovered the full, unvarnished reality of what had happened to her father. But that truth had come at a price she was not prepared to pay. The truth had forced Carol to confront not just her mother's crime, but the very foundation of her identity. It had torn apart the illusions she had lived with for so long, and in doing so, it had taken away the person she had once been. The woman who had grown up believing in a strong, capable mother. The woman who had admired her mother's resilience and selflessness. She was gone now. That person no longer existed. In the weeks that followed, Carol sought therapy, trying to make sense of what had happened. But there was no easy answer. How could there be? No amount of counseling could fix what had been broken. No amount of time could heal the wounds that had been opened. Carol's relationship with Donna was shattered beyond repair. But the hardest part was the realization that, no matter how much she wanted to, Carol could never go back to the way things had been. She could never unlearn what she now knew. The truth had irrevocably altered her perception of her mother and of herself. She was a woman who had once believed in the power of family, in the sanctity of love. But now, Carol had seen the cost of that belief. And she was paying it with her heart, with her sense of self, and with her future. The days after her mother's arrest were a blur, a haze of emotions that Carol couldn't quite name. Everything had changed. The life she had known was over, dismantled piece by piece. Yet, in the midst of the chaos, there was an undeniable sense of finality, one that both repulsed and soothed her. Donna was no longer the figure of warmth and authority in her life. She was an arrested criminal, a woman who had lived with a dark secret, a murderer who had once been her protector. But now, with Donna in custody, Carol faced the uncomfortable truth that she was truly alone. The life she had known, the family she had once cherished, was gone. When the dust settled, Carol tried to resume some semblance of normality. She went back to work, though her focus was fragmented, and she found herself unable to concentrate for long periods of time. Her co-workers were kind, offering her support and understanding, but there was a growing sense of distance. How could they possibly understand what she had been through? No one could. Even the people closest to her could not fully grasp the deep sense of loss she was feeling, not just for her father, but for the version of her mother she had once loved. She felt like a stranger in her own life, lost in a world that no longer made sense. The woman who had been her rock, her anchor, was now a cold, distant figure who could not offer her any comfort. Carol tried to reach out to friends, to family members, but it seemed like no one knew how to approach her. They were all walking on eggshells, unsure of what to say, of how to comfort her. The truth was too raw, too painful for anyone to truly grasp. And even if they could, Carol knew that nothing they said would change the reality of what had happened. No amount of sympathy, no well-meaning gestures could erase the fact that her mother was a killer. That the woman who had once claimed to be a victim of abuse was, in fact, a perpetrator of it. It was during one of these long, lonely nights when she found herself sitting in her dimly lit living room, staring blankly at the television screen, that Carol realized something. She could no longer live in this world of confusion and grief. She could no longer remain in the limbo between the woman she had thought her mother was and the person her mother had truly been. To continue living like this would be a kind of slow death for her spirit. She had to find a way forward, a way to reconcile the past with the present, to rebuild the shattered pieces of her identity. But she knew, deep down, that it would take time. The process would not be quick or easy. The journey ahead would be long, painful, and uncertain. One afternoon, weeks after Donna's arrest, Carol decided to visit the place where it had all started, the family home. She hadn't stepped foot inside the house since the police had come to arrest her mother. It was a place that had once been full of memories, a house where she had spent her childhood, where she had grown up believing in the lie of a perfect family. Now, the house felt empty and foreign, as if it no longer belonged to her. When Carol walked up to the front door, she hesitated, unsure of what she was hoping to find. Would she find closure? Or would it only open up old wounds? She wasn't sure, but something inside her told her that she had to do this. She had to return to that place and face it head-on, without the fog of anger or grief clouding her judgment. She needed to see it for what it truly was, a house that had once held a family built on lies and secrets. It was no longer her home, but she needed to let go of that false attachment to it. With a deep breath, Carol pushed open the door. The familiar creak of the hinges sounded almost surreal. As she stepped inside, she was immediately hit by a wave of nostalgia. The smell of the wood floors, the faint scent of cleaning products mixed with the faint remnants of old meals. Everything was just as it had been. But it was different now. The walls, once filled with the laughter of a family, now felt silent and oppressive. She wandered through the house, taking in the rooms one by one. The kitchen, where Donna had spent hours preparing meals. The living room, where they had sat together on Sunday afternoons, watching television. The stairs that led to the bedrooms, the very stairs where she had heard her father's angry shouts when the violence had started. Each room held a memory, but now those memories felt contaminated by the truth. Carol's footsteps led her to the staircase that would take her up to the room she had shared with Donna. It was a room she had spent countless hours in as a child, a room that had once felt like a sanctuary. But now it felt like a tomb. The bed, the furniture, the small trinkets scattered on the shelves, all of it seemed like a ghost of the life she had once known. She sat on the bed, trying to gather her thoughts, trying to make sense of it all. How had things come to this? How had she ended up in a house full of secrets, with a mother who had murdered her father, and a life that had been built on falsehoods? The questions circled around her like vultures, but Carol knew that the answers wouldn't come easily. They couldn't. Not yet. As she sat there, she realized something that made her heart ache. Donna would never be the mother she had once known. She could never go back to that life. Donna had crossed a line, and that line had irrevocably changed everything. Carol could no longer cling to the idealized version of her mother. She had to accept the reality of who Donna was, flawed, broken, and human. But that acceptance did not mean that Carol had to forgive her. Forgiveness, she realized, was a process she wasn't ready for. It was something that would take time, something that could only come when she was ready. And in that moment, Carol understood that she was not there yet. She needed space to grieve, to mourn the loss of the woman she had once loved, and to rebuild her life on her own terms. Over the next few months, Carol began the slow and painful process of rebuilding her life. She moved out of the family home, finding a small apartment that felt more like a sanctuary than a place to live. It was quiet there, with no echoes of the past to remind her of the life she had lost. She furnished the apartment with pieces that spoke to who she was now, not who she had been. Each item she brought into her new space was a conscious decision, a step toward reclaim. Her life and her identity. Carol also began to focus on her career again. Work had been the one constant that had provided some stability through the chaos of the past months. But now, with the shadow of her mother's crime hanging over her, it became clear to Carol that her career was more than just a distraction. It was a lifeline. Her job gave her a sense of purpose, something to focus on besides the pain and confusion. It gave her the strength to keep going, even on the days when it felt like the world was collapsing around her. Despite her progress, Carol found herself struggling with a deep sense of loneliness. She missed the connection with her mother, the bond they had shared for so many years. It wasn't just that Donna had lied or killed her father. It was that Carol had lost her family, the person who had once been her only support. Now, Carol was forced to navigate a world where she had no one left to turn to, no one to help her make sense of it all. At times, she thought about reaching out to Donna. She thought about visiting her in prison, trying to understand what had driven her mother to do what she had done. But then, Carol would remember the suffocating silence in Donna's eyes, the coldness with which she had tried to kill her, and the horror of seeing her mother reduced to a criminal. Carol wasn't sure if she could ever face Donna again. As the months passed, something inside Carol began to shift. The anger, the hurt, the confusion. They were still there, but they no longer defined her. She had begun to realize that she could not control the past. She could not undo the damage that had been done. What she could do, however, was reclaim her life. She could build a new future, one that was not defined by the lies or the violence of her past. Carol learned to forgive herself first. For so long, she had blamed herself for not knowing the truth about her father's death. She had believed that somehow she could have prevented it, that she should have known something was wrong. But as she reflected on the years of her childhood, she realized that there had been no way to see it. Donna had been a master at hiding the truth, at protecting Carol from the harshness of reality. The healing was slow, but it was happening. The woman who had walked into that family home, shattered and broken, was beginning to reassemble herself, piece by piece. Carol understood that the truth about her past would never be easy to accept, but she no longer feared it. It was her truth now, and she would find a way to live with it. She would find a way to forgive, not Donna, necessarily, but herself. For moving on, for surviving. In the end, Carol understood that this journey, her journey, was about reclaiming her own sense of self, not as a victim of her mother's secrets, but as a woman who had faced the darkest of truths and survived it. It wasn't a perfect ending, and there was still much to work through, but it was a beginning. A new beginning.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.